Hey guys, welcome back to Brock and Sindri. This is Brock, and today I want to talk about a game, or two games actually, that I was absolutely obsessed with for a few years there as a kid. Absolutely enamored with, to the point where I wasn't allowed the games at home because I wasn't old enough and my parents didn't like it. However, my uncle had the games. I had a young cousin, and under the guise of playing with the cousin, I would get in the holidays over to the house where I could then play the game. As despicable as that may be, it was a game series that I really wanted to play. And why was it so? Well, we all loved Grand Theft Auto. These were the games that you could finally do things that you knew weren't okay to do in real life, but you could mess around, you could kill people, you could steal cars, you could drive around, you could do whatever you wanted. The only problem with Grand Theft Auto was that they were all set in these kind of satiricalized LA, Miami, New York, right? This is fine. However, the Getaway came along, and the Getaway was set in London, which is where I grew up. I was fascinated and enamored by this, that I could actually steal red London buses, the same red London buses that used to drive down my old street every day. I was fascinated by this. I was fascinated by the fact that there were the accents, and it was this sort of gritty, grimy, grey London themed sort of GTA game, so to speak. There was a sequel to this game that I only had the chance of playing once and never got to actually complete the story, but I did enjoy it. Now, I was always under the impression that these games did well. Maybe that was because I grew up in London and they were popular in London, but it was the worldwide appeal that obviously didn't happen so huge. So what happened was, I always thought there was going to be more releases, just like with Grand Theft Auto. And so by the time I was old enough, I'd be able to buy the games, I'd be able to play, no worries, but that never happened. They became a relic stuck on PS2. No subsequent ports to PC or to PS3 or even PS4, and I assume not to PS5 at this point as well. They basically just got stuck in that mid-2000s era. Let's talk about them. Let's go through some of the plot, let's go through some of everything to do with them. We'll start with the first one. So the Getaway was obviously an action-adventure, open-world sandbox game, like Grand Theft Auto. It was developed by a company called Team Soho, based in the Soho region of London, and published by Sony Computer Entertainment for the PS2. It was inspired by British gangster films like Get Carter and Snatch. Guy Ritchie, if you've heard of him, Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, this kind of gritty themed gangster movies, which are just incredible. Like the most recent one to have come out from him a couple of years ago with The Gentleman, which is fantastic. Love these movies. So making it in the game would be fantastic. Now, initially the release of the game was supposed to coincide with the launch of the PS2 in the year 2000, but it had to be delayed by 27 months, that's over 2 years, due to their difficulty in recreating large areas of London in high resolution, quote unquote high resolution. Now, it was actually quite a large map of London, and it was a real map. Unlike with some of the GTA where it was sort of real but sort of made up in parts to do with the story, this was all completely supposed to be how London was. Now, the game focused on two characters, each with their own plot settings. Mark Hammond, who was an ex-bank robber, and a detective constable, Frank Carter, a police officer in service with the Flying Squad, with both plots running parallel and then intersecting before concluding in the finale of the game. So it's designed as a third-person sandbox game in which the player controls the two lead characters as they carry out their missions for game progression. Both of the two characters can perform a series of physical tasks like walking, sprinting, rolling, shooting, taking cover during a gunfight. Once Mark Hammond's missions are completed, free roaming is unlocked for his character, which allows roaming around a city district and central London without mission objectives or time limits. Due to similarities to Grand Theft Auto series, it can often be labelled as a Grand Theft Auto clone. The game features a number of licensed vehicles from real automobile manufacturers that the player can control, unlike those seen in Grand Theft Auto, which are all fictional. So the majority of these vehicles in the game are made by MG Rover Group at the time anyway, Jensen Motors, Saab, PSA Peugeot Citroën, Fiat and Lexus, along with some others. And these are all very common cars to be found in London at the time as well. This is the beautiful thing. I'll carry on and then I'll come back to that point. Firearms and weapons available to the player include the Glock 17 pistol, the AK-47 assault rifle, Remington 870 pump action shotgun, and the Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun. Other weapons include a cleaver and a crowbar, among others. A major feature in the game was its approach to immersion and being more movie-like, achieved mostly by not having a typical on-screen HUD heads-up display, such as with car chases being done by signaling the player with the vehicle's indicators to turn, rather than a large arrow above the car, or the player characters limping or bleeding profusely to represent low health instead of a health bar meter. It was basically designed on being real, being like a more real, gritty, grimy game, right? Now, so essentially it was sold as GTA, but more realistic, more grey, more grimy, more gritty, set in London, with a really cool Guy Ritchie style story. And that's exactly what it actually was. We'll go into the plot and we'll go into it. So spoilers alert, by the way, but the game did come out in 2002, so, you know, now, the whole game takes place in London, which actually was during the span of one day, and it was played through the perspectives of the previously mentioned two characters. Firstly, let's go into Mark Hammond's story, because he begins the game, and he was recently released from prison for armed robbery. He witnessed the kidnapping of his own son Alex and the unintentional murder of his wife Susie. He then pursues his son's kidnappers, but is knocked out and brought before Charlie Jolson, the head of the blue-collar Bethnal Green mob, who Mark used to work for. Charlie informs Mark that he is going to carry out Charlie's dirty work across London, such as ambushing a prisoner transfer to spring Charlie's nephew, Crazy Jake Jolson, as well as instigating a gang war between the London-based Yardie gang, the Jamaican gang, and the Chinese Triad organization. Charlie informs Mark that any deviation or failure to carry out his instructions will result in Alex's death. Mark is also reminded of his criminal history, rendering any possibility of police assistance to him unlikely, which was added by Mark unintentionally touching the gun that shot Susie, leading to them believing he killed her and kidnapped Alex. Mark is sent on increasingly risky tasks, culminating in the execution of corrupt Detective Chief Inspector Clive McCormack, who was Mark's arresting officer from 5 years prior, plus Yasmin, one of Charlie's affiliates, in the middle of a police station. However, Mark spares Yasmin's life in return for information on Alex, as she was present at his kidnapping and Susie's murder. In a subsequent mission, Mark steals 300 grand worth of Yardie drug money, but secretly stashes it with Liam, his close friend, having become wary of Charlie's intentions with his son. Mark's suspicions are later confirmed at the cash drop-off. Before Mark can flee, he is captured. Charlie later reveals to Mark and Yasmin that his ultimate plan is to wipe out the rival gangs and take over London in their absence, with Mark being the scapegoat. Detectives Frank Carter and Joe Fielding identify Jake Jolson at a safe house and move in to make the arrest. Joe is wounded in the siege, but Frank successfully arrests Jake. Frank is sent across London to respond to the chaos instigated by Mark Hammond, but his suspicions are aroused when he is placed on a convoy escort duty for Jake Jolson, which Mark successfully attacks. Cormac, Frank's boss, who is also in Charlie Jolson's pocket, suspends Frank on trumped-up charges following the incident. A suspicious Frank follows McCormack to one of Charlie's depots, but before he can clear his name, Mark murders McCormack. Covering in hospital, Joe points Frank toward another one of Charlie's warehouses, where he discovers the captured Mark and Yasmin and agrees to help them in bringing Charlie Jolson down. And in the finale, Mark, Yasmin and Frank converge on the Sol Vita, berthed at St. Saviour's Dock, where Charlie has taken Alex and where he intends on destroying the rival London gangs with a bomb. Mark, after avenging Susie's death, and Yasmin rescue Alex and are able to evacuate the ship mere moments before the bomb detonates, whereas Frank is forced to fight his way off the ship. Bomb's explosion kills Charlie Jolson and the Triad leader, plus several gang affiliates. Now, not the most, expansive storyline. Definitely wouldn't make it to a movie. Not a great one anyway, but enough that would give you good story beats in a game that came out in 2002. Pretty decent. In terms of development, it originally began life on a 32-bit original PlayStation, off the back of Porsche Challenge, who I believe was done by the same company. And after having made an acclaimed circuit driving game, Brendan McNamara, like many other developers at the time, felt like a free roaming vehicle game was an interesting concept worth exploring. So the title was prototyped and playable missions were made, but then it evolved into a PS2 project. However, the original code was kept and there was talk of including it on the finished game, which would ultimately not happen. Apart from several screenshots printed in the official US PlayStation magazine, the original version would never see release. In moving over to vastly more capable hardware, the scope of the title expanded, as did its ambitions. Bizarre creations were generating a lot of attention due to their successful result in reproducing the streets of central London for their Sega Dreamcast racer, Metropolis Street Racer. As MSR was being hyped and primed for release as one of the Dreamcast's so-called killer applications, Sony Computer Entertainment Europe felt compelled to attempt to steal Sega's thunder by promising the creation of a PS2 title which would recreate a massive 113 square kilometers, which was 70 square miles of London, displaying the ferocity with which Sony Computer Entertainment Europe was willing to attempt to challenge its veteran competitor. The final creation actually only yielded an area of 16 square kilometers, which was 10 square miles, but still pretty good. Recreating even 16 square kilometers proved a daunting task and a technical nightmare, factors which may have delayed the release of the Getaway by a couple of years, as mentioned earlier. In the case of the latter, the programmers had to perfect an engine that could constantly stream 3 three-dimensional geometry and texture data of the areas of London the player was currently in close proximity to. At no point would the entire city load into memory, as it just wouldn't fit. And unlike Rockstar's GTA 3, it was not an acceptable option for the Team Soho developers to break the city up into separate regions and impose a loading time delay when crossing between areas. The hype surrounding the project began in earnest just before E3 in 2000, when a series of screenshots were published online. They revealed an amazing level of detail, clearly showing the very identifiable streets near Team Soho's studio. Though it had been argued that these shots were actually mock-up pre-renders, it is possible they were taken from actual code that received further detailed vehicle and character models, higher resolution textures, and also an anti-aliased the final output. Although the prototype game was constantly shown behind closed doors, the public was not privy to its results for at least another year. It was only finally made playable at E3 2002. By then, the project had ballooned, exceeding its development budget many times over. Sony Computer Entertainment Europe had a range of other titles in development, however, and the decision was taken by Phil Harrison to can many of them, perhaps to allow yet more funds to be poured into the Getaway. As a result of this, the axe was to fall on two of its studios, Sony Computer Entertainment Europe Manchester and Sony Computer Entertainment Europe Leeds. Now, when the game was launched in December 2002, it was a huge seller across Europe, especially in the UK. Worldwide, and particularly in the US, the game had received some mixed reviews and sales though, and the fact that it was released around the same time as the hugely popular GTA Vice City, to which the game was often then compared, then hurt some of its sales despite a large marketing campaign in the US. Now, just to touch on that, some of these comparisons were not misfounded, because yes, it had a lot of similarities, but were maybe a little bit harsh, in the sense that not every open world sandbox action adventure, and that was just the GTA clone. It was a very different model, it's a very different type of story, and not a satire as well. So I think that it was probably a bit harsh, and yes, I do remember Vice City being my seminal GTA game, which I'd managed to, for a summer holiday, actually in 2003, a few months later, I managed to borrow with a friend, and this was the first summer where I was fully alone during the day. Both my parents were off at work. My younger brother, who runs his channel with me, was in nursery at the time, and I was able to play during the day from about 9:30 in the morning to probably about 5 o'clock at night. I wasn't going to risk anything closer than that, just in case. I think I'd swapped it with him for a few months for Enter the Matrix game, which he wanted to play and didn't have, and we'll do a video on that one soon as well. Now, the issue with this game was probably it was harder for a lot of people to understand the system at the time, in the sense that it was probably a little bit ahead of time actually. But if this game came out now with modern day graphics and a more expansive story, maybe a bit more, I think it would be huge, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. So let's go on to the soundtrack. Now, the game soundtrack was complemented by a title song and cutscene soundtrack, which was performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, which was huge, by the way. The game's soundtrack was chiefly composed by Andrew Hale, while portions of the soundtrack were also written by Sean Lee, who would later compose music for another sandbox-style game by Rockstar, Bully, an awesome game. We'll do a video on that one someday too. Now, there was some controversy for this game. One alteration that the team had to make was the removal of a vehicle and phone box logos which had appeared in the initial release of the game. During one of Hammond's missions, a British Telecom's BT van is used in a mission in which Hammond must kill the driver and take the van to then assassinate a corrupt police officer. BT complained that it did not want its name and livery associated with the violent scenes in the game, as it was worried that it might incite attacks on its engineers. Although the initial release of the game was not recalled, subsequent production was amended to remove the offending details. I would love to get a copy of that original release of the game. It was also banned in Australia. It was originally passed with an MA15+ rating for the uncut version on the 22nd of November 2002, was resubmitted and banned 5 days later due to a particular scene of detailed torture. A censored version omitting the scene was then released on December the 13th the same year with the identical rate. And now the issue in Australia, as I've subsequently found since moving here, was that for many years Australia never had an R18 rating for games. So any game that was R18 elsewhere in the world and able to be how it was had to be either not released in Australia or amended like this. Again, if it had come out just 10 or 12 years later, it would have been fine. Now let's talk about the reception that it received, and it received mostly average reviews overall, but some really good ones depending on where you were based. So Maxim gave the game a score of 8 out of 10 and wrote, "If the ensuing police brutality doesn't mold you into the model wheelman, then having to endure those whiny English cop sirens surely will." FHM also gave it a score of 4 out of 5 and said, "Not just a little similar to GTA 3 in look, feel and gameplay, it's nonetheless worth sleeping in front of the game store for this one. However, the Cincinnati Enquirer, so the first US, like full US based one, gave the game a score of 3.5 stars out of 5 and said that the biggest hindrance in the Getaway involves its user interface, or lack thereof, as a development team attempted to make the game look and play like a movie. I mean this with no offense whatsoever, but US audiences need things dumbed down for them compared to like a British audience, let's say. And I don't mean this in a mean way, and I'm sure some of you that are based in the US could either tell me that I'm completely wrong, unsubscribe, whatever, or maybe back me up on this, right? Because I think most of you that are on this channel from the US are actually quite smart and probably don't need to be dumbed down as much. But the heads up display, like, does knowing exactly what your health is from a bar, or having a small mini map, does that improve a gaming experience, or does that actually, does that take away? Because I actually think that it's one of these issues with modern gaming, is this fast travel, mini map, like gold dotted line, like in The Witcher 3, that leads you where you need to go, actually is not always a good thing in every game. Sometimes it's good just to get in a car and then the indicator tells you when you need to turn, for example, or your player's limping a little bit with a bit of blood and he's panting, and so you just have to stand up against the wall to be healed. I actually liked that mechanic. I thought it had a real future. And interestingly enough, it slightly resurfaces, or it actually almost completely resurfaces to a certain extent, the health-wise in LA Noire, which was made by Team Bondi in Australia, but also produced by Rockstar. So I will talk about this more at the end of the video, but it was always going to be a thing that the setting was probably okay to a certain extent. However, the mechanic, the actual gameplay mechanic seemed to suffer in the US, and we all know that if you want to be successful and have a really good launch, make good amounts of money, you do need to have a good amount of success in the US. Entertainment Weekly was also very negative of the game, giving it a D, and stating the level of detail is extraordinary. Even the facial expressions are motion captured, but the slickest graphic presentation can't cover for the Getaway's flawed script. And later on says, in a game infused with more humor and less pretentious aspirations, these flaws would be more forgivable. And again, Entertainment Weekly proves they just didn't get it. It's a gritty London gangster game. As I said, it's not the best story in the world, but it's a decent one. It's a serviceable one for a game, and it sets up more. That's all it was supposed to do. Now, to me, infusing with more humor, what does that sound like? It sounds like GTA. So let's add more humor in, get away from the grittiness, which actually takes it away from what it's about and what it is, which is a gritty London gangster game inspired by movies such as Lock, Stock, Two Smoking Barrels, and Snatch. Sales of the Getaway had reached 300,000 copies within 2 weeks of the game's release, which is really good, and it received a double platinum sales award from the Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association, ELSPA, indicating sales of at least 600,000 copies in the United Kingdom. And to put that into context, at the time the population of the UK was about 60 million, which means that 1% of the entire population owned a copy. That's massive, considering what it was. And to be more precise, when you say your average household was, 3 people, right? So there's 20 million households on average. So you do the maths. That's like, I don't know, more than 1%. No, it's about 6% or 4% or whatever. My maths is really bad today, but it doesn't matter. It's quite a high percentage of households had it, which is huge, right? And so considering it was an 18 in the UK and everything else, anyway, by July 2006, the Getaway had actually sold 1 million copies and earned $36 million US in the US. Next Generation ranked it as the 53rd highest selling game launch for the PS2, Xbox, or GameCube generation between January 2000 and July 2006 in the US alone. According to Mike Rouse, who was a former Sony developer who worked on the Getaway, it sold almost 4 million copies in total. Massive! In a retrospective article from 2014, Den of Geek made the game number 23 in their top 50 underappreciated PS2 games list. And in 2020, Push Square included the game and its sequel in a list of games they would like to see released on the PS4. So it's one of those that you could quite rightly say that to a larger audience, it didn't quite work. It sold well, it did pretty well, but it didn't quite work. But there was interest. It actually reminds me of Cyberpunk 2077. It sold really well. And to a wider audience that thought they were getting into a GTA-like game, they were left a little bit disappointed. And is that the fault of the game or the developers, or is that the fault of people talking about it and people's expectations? Now, I want to talk about the sequel, which is called The Getaway Black Monday. The Getaway Black Monday, pretty much the same. Now, it's developed by a company called London Studio, which was basically the same studio, which we'll look into after we talk about the games. Now, again, it came out in 2004. It's a sequel to 2002's The Getaway, set in London, had new characters, completely new story. The game features about 100 140 different playable vehicles, which were licensed from companies like Rover, who's a British company, Brabus, who is a German company. Anyway, they recreated like Mercedes and smart cars and stuff like that. Persian Citroën again, Renault. So real cars that were quite common and popular and familiar on the streets of London. Let's go straight into the plot. Game begins with a flashback sequence. Sergeant Ben Mitchell is chasing down an armed teenage robber. Teen robber stops running instead of aiming his gun at Mitch. Mitch orders him to drop his weapon, but the teen then chooses to try to turn around and escape. Mitch fires his weapon, which makes it seem like he purposefully shot the teen in the back. A year later, Mitch is on his first day back on the team, and the team heads towards an East London housing estate where they believe the Collins crew is storing drugs in a flat. So the team breaks into the flat but finds it empty. Only 2 Collins members, but PC Harvey and another SO19 officer find a door that leads to the flat next door and then find tons of drugs. They soon chase them down in the apartment complex and PC Harvey is injured in the leg. Mitch single-handedly hunts down the remaining suspects who take an old woman hostage on the roof. Back at the station, Mitch is taunted about the teenager shooting incident and almost loses his temper. Inspector Monroe then informs them of a shooting at a boxing club in Shoreditch. After arriving at the scene, Mitch chases Jimmy Collins, who manages to escape. Monroe suspects that a Latvian gang is responsible and reassigns Mitch and Stoppard to join a unit of SO19 who are preparing to raid a scrapyard in Lambeth, South London, to detain a suspect. Stratov is immediately bailed out and leads Mitch to Jackie Phillips. She informs them of the deal going down at Holborn Tube Station at platform 4, and Mitchell attempts to arrest the trader, but he escapes and is arrested afterwards. Jackie makes a phone call saying she knows the leader as the phone goes dead. When they arrive, a man shoots Monroe and leaves him in Jackie's apartment, which explodes, killing him. Jackie left a note saying Scoble. While the police know a gun trade is going down, Mitch beats the trader and extracts the info, which leads them to a warehouse. The game then shifts to Eddie O'Connor's story. It's a new character. Nick and Jimmy Collins had originally planned to steal credit card codes and print their own cards. When Danny West owes a gambling debt to Collins, he forces West to get people to steal the credit card codes from the Scoble group and steal the icon, which is a small religious artifact, which in the end is revealed to be a case in which diamonds are hidden, so that no one realizes the card codes are stolen. Eddie, along with others, raid the Scoble group's bank to retrieve the icon, but everyone is killed except Eddie, who is tortured, Sam Thompson, who escapes through a vent, and John the cleaner, who double crosses and runs off with the icon. Eddie and Sam escape and they find John dead at a bar, but Eddie manages to retrieve the icon. They then return to the boxing club and see Mitch enter. Sam sneaks in and sees Danny and a young boy, presumably Errol's son, dead, as well as Liam Spencer from the first game. Sam left the laptop at the bank and wants to return, and if Eddie says yes, they shoot their way in, but if he says no, Eddie leaves her and she sneaks in. Sam retrieves the laptop. If Eddie escorts her, she doesn't get caught, but if he doesn't, she gets caught. Eddie tracks down Collins, who mentions that Victor Scoble, the CEO of the Scoble group, killed West. Yuri then shoots Collins' right hand 3 times before finishing with a shot in the head. Eddie follows Yuri to lead Scoble. He's ambushed by Nadia Proshnikova, who has Jackie. Sergeant Mitch raids the warehouse, and this is where his story ends off, and Eddie then kills Yuri. Then either saves Jackie Phillips or lets her fall to her death. Either way, Eddie escapes and chases Victor to his house, where he kills Nadia, and if the player chooses to, Zara. If Sam hasn't been captured, she sneaks into Alexi's car. Eddie chases Victor to his yacht and kills Alexi. There are 4 different endings depending on the player's actions throughout the game. The final scene shows the outside of the pumping station. The police are standing by, and Sam and Mitch stand there if they are alive. Alright, before I go into the reception of this game. So the story to the Getaway 1 was not amazing, but it was serviceable for the type of the game. Now, this game became more convoluted. It was trying to go from a different aspect, and the story, I'd never played through the game, so learning the story, looking it up, it's not as good. They missed the mark, but what they were trying to do, you could see. It was a bigger map of London, like you could go a lot further. The graphics were improved, a lot of the gameplay was improved, but it had essentially the same mechanic. But there was this added thing of the choices that they put in there, and now looking at that, I think that the choices were a good attempt. We've seen games do this over the years and give you choices in different ways to get to some of the same things with slightly different things happening, and I think that was a good thing to do. But the highest score that I can see it receive from anyone was 7 out of 10 by, I think, Game Informer. Nobody else really even got close, and there's a good reason for that. So it did receive a Platinum Sales Award from the Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association again, and according to Mike Rouse, the game sold just over 2 million copies, so it's still pretty successful, but not quite as successful as the first one. And then it was obviously met with mixed reception upon release. In Japan, Famitsu gave it a score of 2.8 and 2 7s for a total of 30 out of 40, which seems okay but not great. Maxim then gave the game a score of 4 stars out of 5, which actually seems like it did better than the first one by Maxim standards, and said, "Fun as this game is to play, the best moments come when you just sit back and observe. Wonderfully acted, written and directed motion capture cutscenes played like the Snatch follow-up Guy Ritchie should have made. Further evidence of the narrowing gap between video game and movie production values." On the contrary though, Detroit Free Press gave it a score of 2 stars out of 4 and stated that the underworld figures are colourful and the language the characters use has a life of its own, but the game's design is bollocks. Now I don't know if that's Detroit Free Press trying to sound cool, because tell me if I'm wrong, US guy, people in watching and listening. Is bollocks used in the US? I mean, I moved from the UK to Australia. I don't really hear bollocks in Australia, and Australia has arguably closer slang to the UK than the US does, and I've never heard it over here apart from when I or another Englishman has been using it. So tell me in the comments, is bollocks something that's used in the US? The Sydney Morning Herald also gave it a similar score of 2.5 stars out of 5 and said that the AI of other characters is often quite dim, enemies are often oblivious to your nearby presence, while colleagues provide little genuine assistance. I mean, that's pretty much a plague of many games. So, like, it's still fair criticism, right? But it's not only like this game's fault. But clearly, it didn't do quite as well. It wasn't such a good follow-up. It still sold all right though. So the question is, what happens next? Why did they not get any more? And so on that, first of all, there's been many rumors, and we were told that the Getaway 3 was to be the 3rd installment of Sony's The Getaway for the PS3 console, and the title was then reported as cancelled on the 4th of June 2008, along with another game called 8 Days by the same developer. In October 2009, the games were reported as not being cancelled but actually on hold. A technical demo featuring Piccadilly Circus, which is a really famous spot in London, was demonstrated in May 2005 at E3, but this was not directly from the game. It was confirmed that the game would again be set in London. Information regarding the Getaway 3 was released on the 7th of March 2008 by screenplay writer Katie Elwood, who affirmed the action title was still in the works. No estimated release date was given, but Elwood did say that Sony execs were making deals with film companies about the possibility of a future film adaptation of The Getaway 3. Yeah, Nicolas Doucet said, "I would not say they have been abandoned, just put to one side. Much work had to be done. The studio just wanted to focus on its strengths, iToy and SingStar. Given the potential of iPet, priorities have been changed, but the other projects aren't dead yet. Ultimately, the decision to put those games to one side had benefited everyone." And Richard Bunn, a former dev, had noted the game was cancelled shortly after Phil Harrison was replaced by Shuhei Yoshida as a president of SCE Worldwide Studios. So basically no sign of any follow-up at all. It seems to be just totally dead in the water now. Interestingly, didn't fully die, because in 2006 there was the release of a video game called Gangs of London, which was an action-adventure open-world video game for the PSP. It was developed by London Studio, the same studio, and then published by Sony Computer Entertainment. The player had the choice to play as 5 different gangs in London with different ethnicities and outfits. In the gameplay, during the course of the story mode, the player is given a wide variety of objectives. One objective may require entering a nightclub armed with a jackhammer, while other may involve trying to run the enemy off the road or them trying to run the player off the road. There are also kidnapping missions, stealth missions, and race missions. Once the story mode is complete, a cliffhanger ending happens, and outside of the missions, the player can free roam the game's environment and complete mini-games, such as taking photos of London landmarks or running over pedestrians, as you do. The game also has bar-style mini-games accessed from a pub. The 4 pub games are darts, Skittles, pool, and an arcade game, which is similar to Snake. Apart from the Skittles, which is a bit old school now, those other 3 games are pretty common. The premise. At his country estate, Maurice Kane, a veteran gangster and leader of his own firm, breeds pigeons in preparation for an upcoming competition. The next morning, he is horrified to find out that all the pigeons have been slaughtered. Kane soon vows to take over the city. In Westminster, Eastern European crime lord Vladislav Zakharov is planning to purchase a Fabergé egg to add to his collection. Returning home, Zakharov finds that his mansion is touched and, enraged by the loss of his paintings and silver, vows to make London suffer. Mason Grant, leader of the Yardi EC2 crew, is out on a date with his girlfriend Chantel. She is later assassinated by an unseen sniper while at a cafe with Grant. He vows revenge in response to her death. Inside a gambling den, Two water dragon triads are intimidated by another who will do whatever it takes to win a game of mahjong. During the game, a bomb goes off, killing the triads. Triad leader Sancho Yang declares war on the other gangs. Finally, Indian-British gangster Asif Rashid, sounds more Pakistani than Indian, so that might be wrong, who leads the Talwar brothers, learns that his brother has been set up and arrested by armed police SCO-19, and determined to bail his brother, Rashid assembles his gang to take over London. And the game received mixed reviews according to the video game review aggregator Metacritic. I'm looking through, and the highest score I can see, 6 out of 10 from Game Informer again, but pretty much most of it was crappy reviews. And I actually did play this game once, actually. That's the lie, I did play this. I actually broke my leg in 2006, and one of my dad's work colleagues lent me his PSP as I basically just to help keep me entertained for a few months. And this was one of the games that I played on the PSP along with the King Kong game that came out, which was also pretty crappy. The Gangs of London it was okay, like for a PSP game it was okay, but that was about it. So Team Soho was the original developer, which was founded in 1994, and they didn't have much experience in the video game industry because most of them were kind of recent college graduates. So they started out developing NBA Shootout, which basically came out in 1996. But in 2002, it was closed and merged with Psygnosis' Camden studio to form London Studio, so they became this other studio. This team was retained for Getaway Black Monday, so it was the same team for the most part. Now, interestingly enough, Getaway's creative director Brendan McNamara founded Team Bondi in mid-2003 and had hired several former staff members of Team Soho. And what did Team Bondi make? LA Noire, one of my other favourite games, and which employs a lot of the same mechanics, that ended up getting bought by Rockstar. So let's talk about what happened to London Studio, because I want to trace what's going on here. So now London Studio is a British video game developer based in London. It's still going. Founded in 2002, it's a first-party studio for PlayStation Studios, meaning it's owned by them direct. The studio is most well known for developing the SingStar series, as well as games for PlayStation's external peripherals, including the iToy camera and the PlayStation VR virtual reality headset. Well, interesting. So what I think happened, and I'm sure I could do some more research, I'm not a journalist, I'm just an armchair person, but what I think happened is the original team that made The Getaway were desperate to carry on making that series and had it as a passion project for them, and eventually broke away to form Team Bondi that made LA Noire, but unfortunately ran into money troubles again with LA Noire and were then completely bought up by Rockstar. And LA Noire is another one that's not been touched since. But let's talk about The Getaway series. I'm coming into a land with this one. This is a bit of a different type, but I hope you enjoy it. Apologies for the long video, but I hope you enjoy it. Now, coming from London, I'd always wanted to make a game myself, and I always wanted to make it a la The Getaway, a la GTA, as based in London. What sort of games have we been treated to that are set in London over the years, and how many good ones? Apart from the odd mission in like Tomb Raider 3 in a underground tube station, he had one appearance in an Uncharted game, I think Uncharted 3 if I remember rightly, from about 10 or 12 years ago. Apart from that, we've had GTA London, which wasn't really London and was a bird's eye view in the 90s. We've had The Getaway 1 and 2 and The Gangs of London on PSP, and then we had two others now that I can think of that have been good. Now, there's probably more, but in terms of good, like high level good ones, we had Assassin's Creed Syndicate, set in Victorian London. Oh, there was Vampire as well, that was also set in Victorian London, and that was a good game too, but it was a fictionalized version. But we also had Syndicate, which was quite good, and it was at a time when, and it's documented on the channel, I was falling completely out of love with Assassin's Creed, but I would welcome coming back to Victorian London in a heartbeat. And then Watch Dogs Legion from about a year and a half ago. I really wanted to like Watch Dogs Legion. I really like Watch Dogs for what it is, but it was just awful. I couldn't finish it. I just couldn't finish it. So we've been deprived of some real high quality games in London. I would love to see a GTA, like a modern GTA set in London as one of the cities, for example. It doesn't have to be the only one, but as one of them. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So realistically, what can we hope for? I would really implore the team that made The Getaway, that made LA Noire, that I think are now part of Rockstar, not PlayStation. I'd really hope that they would find a way to get a good writer in to write an actually good story. Hell, maybe even Guy Ritchie himself, and either do an LA Noire type detective game set in London, you know, maybe from the 40s, for example, or the 30s or whatever, or an actual follow-up to The Getaway, but one that is Guy Ritchie written, because that will be so much better. And I think The Getaways and LA Noire came too soon for the gaming world, and I think if they all came now with today's technology, with the mocap stuff going on and becoming more common again, with the different choices and everything else and the storytelling nature of games, I think they would be a hit. Anyway, that's probably going to do it for me in this video. This is just a bit of a retrospective into the Getaway and the Getaway Black Monday and London raised kids or adult now's desperate plea for another Getaway game or another London based game. I hope you guys like this format. I'm gonna start doing a series on sort of forgotten or underappreciated games from the past like this. Let me know if you have any that you'd like me to look into, and let me know what you think of this video format, guys. If you liked it, if you think I could maybe refine it even more and see where we go. But I'm really interested into this kind of video format, so yeah, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video, guys. Cheers.